everybody, it's your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Hi, Patty.
Hey, Stu, how are you this afternoon?
Fantastic, and you?
I'm doing really good.
I'm caffeinated, so I'm really fantastic.
You're perky.
Uh-huh.
So, well, today I thought we would talk about possessed objects. We had a gentleman in our group that had asked for this, and I spent a few days just making sure I polished off a few details on it. There's another one coming up that was somebody else requested of me. They requested it directly. They met me someplace and said, hey, I really would like you to do a podcast about witches. So we're going to be doing that in October.
Okay.
But today is possessed objects. And this is actually a topic I have a lot of interest in and always have, because one of the things that you deal with sometimes when you're doing an investigation, which I've done investigations for a long time, and it's sometimes a possessed object, an object that holds the essence or the spirit, if you will, of somebody who had once possessed it, owned it. By definition, a possessed object is an object that moves on its own or brings bad luck. But I would like to say that I don't necessarily agree with that. Sometimes they'll say, well, they always bring death or bad stuff. I'd like to tell you, I have a good friend, and she bought a cannonball. And she bought it in West Virginia. And it was just, it was a Civil War cannonball. She thought it was really cool. She saw it on her mantle and what have you. But there was a lot of activity after she brought the cannonball to her house. She would have her teenage daughter started to hear a voice. She would see somebody walking from the living room into the dining room area. A lot of activity going on. The animals would shy away from it. They heard percussion, almost like a gun going off a couple times. Just a lot of activity. There's no way, because it was just a cannonball, to ascertain where it came from, what battle, if it was Union or if it was Confederate, nothing like that. So we don't have a history on it. But what we can say is it was getting to the place where her daughter was very, very uncomfortable in her house. And that's not something she wanted for her child. So she brought the cannonball to my house and said, do you want to hang on to this for a while, see if it does anything up here? And it was completely quiet. Like nothing happened the entire time. So I said to her, nothing's happening. You can probably take the cannonball back. She took the cannonball back. She did not put it on the mantle. Her daughter did not even know she brought it back. She put it in her closet. And that very night, her daughter said, where's the cannonball, Mom? And she's like, why? She's like, because I heard him walking in the kitchen again, and the animals are acting all freaky. So wow. The following weekend, she brought it back up to me, and it stayed with me until it went to live with John Zaffis. And I have to tell you, it didn't do anything bad, but my guess is that in some fashion, a Union soldier is attached to it. And when he was in the South, when he was crossing the Mason-Dixon line, he was busy, if you will, never hurt anybody or deliberately set out to scare anybody. He never appeared and was aggressive, but he didn't seem happy. He was restless. And when he came back north, it got very quiet. So I'm assuming it was more comfortable. And like I said, it now resides with John Zaffis in his museum of possessed objects. So I don't think they always are terrible things. Sometimes it's just something like that. But there are some possessed objects that are really nasty. In England, there is a painting called The Crying Child. Now, it's a painting that's been mass produced. So there's a ton of reproductions, and people began to take note. There was actually a fireman who had this experience, the first experience, and began to put the pieces together. They were called to a house fire, and hanging in the living room, which is where the fire started, was this painting. It's a little boy, blue eyes, with tears rolling down his face. Obviously, the crying boy. He looks to be about 5. The fire had devoured most of the room, but it had left the painting somehow unmarked. And he noted it and commented on it because that was odd. The fire was licking up the wall where the painting was, and that didn't catch on the wooden frame. Just an oddity. And fires are very fickle, if you will. So he didn't think a whole lot of it. And then over the course of time, there had been a couple other houses he had attended fires, to fight fires at, that had the same painting. And again, the similar situation. Well, how many times is it a coincidence? And then, how many times does it take before you begin to think there's a pattern going on? So he began to ask around, and people started coming out of the woodwork saying, "Oh my God, that's exactly what happened at my house. I had that painting, and my house caught fire, and it's one of the few things that survived the fire." And so the painting got a very bad reputation. Now, is it deserved or not? I can't tell you if it's deserved or not, because like so many of these things, with the internet and going on and everything, how much of it's suggestion and what have you is difficult to say. But there are a list of people who claim that their homes burned with this painting in it, and that they destroyed the painting eventually because they were afraid of it. It became kind of malevolent, if you will. And so that's one where harm befell the families. And there were several firemen who came forward who said, "Yeah, I've been in houses where the same phenomena happened and that painting was hanging." And like I said, it was mass produced. So there were thousands of them all over, England. And I'm sure some of them made it to the United States and other places as well. So, like again, you have to go back to how much is a coincidence. I don't know. But a lot of times with possessed objects, the stories become a preponderance of coincidences, going from coincidence into a pattern that seems to fit something much more sinister than just chance. Another one that people talk about also from England is something called Thomas Busby's chair. So Thomas Busby was kind of a brute. He lived in England in the mid 1800s, and he had this pub that he would go to and frequent. Busby, he was aggravated and angry all the time, and he was always fighting with somebody and what have you. And he eventually ran afoul of the law in a significant way and got arrested. And he knew that when he got arrested, that he would be convicted and executed for his crimes. And he cursed the chair that was his chair there. He always had this one chair he would always sit in. Nobody thought anything of it. He was tried, he was convicted and what have you, and he was executed. And then after his death, the proprietor of the place began to notice that people that frequented that chair had bad things happen. They died in very bizarre ways. It got to the point where 4, 5, 6 people in a row who sat in that chair within a day or so were dead. And he got scared, and he hung the chair on the wall so nobody could sit on it. In fact, the chair still hangs on the wall today. If you go to this tavern in England, Busby's chair is hanging high up on the wall because he's afraid to let anybody sit in it.
I think I'd be hanging it on the wall upside down. So there'd be no way someone could sit in it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple other such stories in the area. We'll have to come back and tell another one. There's one from Pennsylvania where, again, a malevolent entity has attached to this chair, and they've actually roped the chair off. It's in a very historic home, and it's only one of many hauntings in this house. But this one is so virulent that the owner, an older gentleman, actually roped the chair off, and he has stuff across the chair so that there's no way you could sit on it, because he's afraid of it. He's lost several people that he loved who challenged the chair and sat in it. And that's down in Philadelphia area. His name is George Mead Easby. His mansion. It's a beautiful chair. It's a very expensive chair. It's an antique. It's got historical significance, but and he doesn't want to destroy it for those reasons. It's just not worth the risk of sitting in the chair. So he has made sure no one can sit in it anymore. So there are things like that happen and happen all over the world. There's stories of such things. There's a story from Florida about a doll. There was a little boy, and he would grow up to become a very famous artist. His parents were very well to do, and his nanny was a Haitian woman, and this would have been early 20th century. And he was a very lonely child. His mother was always a social butterfly, going places. His father was morose and always busy with business, and so he was fairly isolated as a child. And his Haitian nanny thought that he needed companionship besides her. So she had contracted with somebody she knew. Some people say it was her mother, that she would get a doll that looked like her little charge, Robert. She had a life-size doll made of this little boy, and he has a little sailor hat and a little blue sailor suit on, and and he's what have you. And the little boy fell in love with this doll the minute he saw it, and it became his best friend. He would spend hours talking to this doll, endlessly talking to this doll, playing with it, moving it around. He would start to tell people things like, Robert wants you to bring him a sandwich, or, Robert wants to sit in that window and look out. And people would appease him because, well, first of all, he was the child of a very rich person. Second of all, what was the harm? He was just a little boy. And maybe he wanted the sandwich, but he blamed it on Robert the doll, So it was very benign in the beginning, but then things got a lot more sinister. His mother and other staff at the house where he lived began to talk about hearing somebody answering him back when he was alone in the room. And when they would open the door and say, "Who's in here with you?" He'd say, "Oh, it's just me and Robert." And it got very creepy. People began to get very uncomfortable because they would hear voices. They would put the doll, like Robert would be in school, and they would put the doll in his bedroom sitting in a rocking chair, and they would come to find it sitting, looking out the window an hour later, and they're the only people in the house. Stuff like that would happen, and people got very uncomfortable with the doll. Well, eventually Robert, the man, grew up and inherited his parents' home and got married and had a life. But he never let go of this doll. And he had taken 2 rooms in the top of the house, like a garret type area, and he had made them Robert's bedrooms. So the doll actually had its own set of rooms. And he would go up there and he would paint and he would talk to the doll. And even though he was married, his wife hated the doll, and she kind of banished it to those rooms. And she just thought the whole thing was creepy. And she often told him there was something wrong with the doll. And it reminded her very much of a voodoo doll in some ways. And one of the things that was really interesting is as Robert aged, the doll seemed to age. Its hair started to come out and faded, receding, and its features, which were very childlike, they had shaped the cloth and stuffing to make this child's, cherubic face, all changed. And it became very noticeable. It got more active as he got older, and she would tell stories, and the staff again of like Robert the doll would be locked in the garret, and they would have it, they'd put it in a closet because they didn't like looking at it, and they would come up an hour or two later, or later in the next day or whatever, and nobody had been up there, and it was moved. It was sitting looking out the window or sitting at the table or whatever. And this went on for years. So if it was a joke, it was the most elaborate joke on the planet. And it would have had to have been somebody who was there all that time. Well, when her husband passed away, she finally decided to get rid of the doll. She gave it to a museum in the area because it did have some historical significance, because her husband was a famous artist, and it had a cool story attached to it and what have you. And they have it to this day. Now, they have kind of quarantined it because they've talked about the fact that it does move. Like they have found it sitting in a different chair than when they left the museum the night before, and things like that. So they now kind of have him kind of in a situation where he's kind of boxed in and he can't go anywhere. But there are many people who believe that something happened and attach itself to that doll, whether it was his energy, the little boy's lonely energy, or if something was attached before the doll was given to him, or something just came in and took advantage. But it is very much considered a possessed object.
It really sounds like it was imbued with something.
It does. And, you know, it was just the way he focused on it. It was like it became his entire life. Like he never let this doll go. I mean, what adult man, you know, comes home and says to his wife, "This is Robert, my doll." But, you know, when she came to live at the house, she found out Robert had a place of honor. He used to sit at the table with them and stuff like that. And that's when she said, like, enough is enough, I'm done. And she banished the doll to the garret upstairs.
Yep. One big red flag.
Yes, one very big red flag. You know, there's just so many such stories, and you see them all the time. So another story that I would like to talk about is Rudolph Valentino. Rudolph Valentino had a beautiful ruby ring. Now, for those who don't know who Rudolph Valentino was, I'll just give a little backstory. He was one of the biggest, most famous actors during the silent movie era. He was the heartthrob of thousands upon tens of thousands of young ladies. In fact, he's probably the first serious romantic heartthrob of the modern cinematic era. Women would faint when he would walk in. You know, there were just all kinds of stories of them going on. He had never made a movie that was not very, very lucrative. So he was really big box office draw for them. And there's a movie, I think it's called The Sheik, which is where you'll see the ring turn up for the first time. And, you know, he's playing an Arabic sheik, and, you know, he comes swooping in, and he's got these dark, swarthy eyes and the dark hair, and he's laying the young woman in his arms, you know, kissing her. And it was like a romantic thing from, you know, most romantic thing that these young ladies probably ever saw. And that's where you'll first see the ring come in. So basically the story behind the ring is he was walking along Sunset Strip in Hollywood, California, and he saw a pawn shop, and in the pawn shop where there was this really big ruby ring, and something about this ring just caught his attention, and he couldn't walk past it. Now, this man was at that time what we would call filthy rich for that period. He was very, very well to do. He could have definitely afforded a much more beautiful and ornate ring than this one, but this ring caught his attention. He went in and he insisted on buying it. Interestingly enough, he would later tell the story and say that the pawnbroker kept trying to talk him out of buying the ring, saying, "Oh, no, you don't want that ring. How about this beautiful gold ring?" And, you know, like he knew there was something wrong with it. And finally, the guy told him the ring was cursed. He's like, "The guy that brought it in told me this story, and I don't know if it's true or not, but you don't really want this ring. You don't want to take a chance on it," you know, because he knew who this man was. And Valentino insisted. So he wore the ring, and nearly everything he did afterward was a flop. But more than that, he started to get sick. He got deathly ill and would die from these illnesses, a very young man, only a couple years after purchasing the ring. He had willed the ring to one of his dear friends and a former lover. Her name was Paula Negre, and he had given her the ring in his will, and she wore the ring for quite a while. And again, everything in her life turned ugly. She was ill constantly. She couldn't, you know, find any financial success, even though she had been very well to do and very famous. She was also an actress at the time. And eventually she would die because of the ring. And it was at that point that it is believed she willed the ring to somebody else, and that ring disappeared after her death and prior to the next person getting it. And to this day, nobody has the faintest clue what happened. But she was completely convinced the last months of her life that the ring is what killed her, was killing her. She took it off. She had it locked up. And when they went to open the safe to go through her contents, which is, they know that's where she placed the ring. There were people who saw her do so. She was so ill she could really not get out of bed very shortly thereafter. So the odds are not good that she was out there trying to open this great big safe. And, you know, she would have told a servant to do it, which is what she usually did. And because there was a particular person there that she trusted and who could do so. And when they opened the safe to get the ring and all of her documents were there, but the ring was now gone. So to this day, nobody knows what happened to that ring.
Curious.
It is curious. And if you follow down, you know, the ring, Valentino would come to believe that it was bad. And he actually said in his will, when he willed it to Paula Negra, that she should not wear it, but just to keep it as a memento. But she slid it on her finger, and apparently that was enough.
I wonder if it was made out of radium or something like that.
I don't know. That's an interesting point. But whatever it was, I mean, I could see that making the physical illness, but the financial component, like, this is a man who never made a bad movie. He never made a bomb. And then after he put the ring on, he couldn't make a good movie. Nothing worked in his life. His romantic life went south. His financial, you know, prospects and his movie projects, everything went away. He lost his popularity. It just seemed like everything changed in his life for the negative. So the next one is a story that has captured my attention for a long time. This was a story, now back in the 80s when Unsolved Mysteries was just coming into its prime.
Right.
It was one of the very few things. There were not ghost shows anywhere. Just there weren't. You know that, and I know that, because, you know, I'm an old chick, and I can tell you. So Unsolved Mysteries was one of the very first places where people began to tell ghost stories on TV. And every so often, not every week, but every so often, they would come up with these fascinating ghost stories. This story I heard, I was maybe late teens. This is the first time I heard the story. So this is the story of the Tallman family. Now, they were a family in the Midwest. It was a man and his wife and his kids, a couple kids, 2 daughters. And they bought a house and moved in. It had 3 bedrooms. And so they had, I think, 2 daughters and a little boy. So they decided that they had the master bedroom. The little boy would get the smaller bedroom. The girls would get the larger bedroom. And to make it wasn't that much larger than the other bedroom. So to make some space, they decided to buy a set of bunk beds to,
Okay.
take up less space in the room. And so they did. They bought a set of wooden bunk beds, and they weren't in great shape. They bought them at a secondhand store, but he figured he could doctor them up and make them look a lot better. So he brought them home, and they'd been in the house about 4 or 5 months at this point. He put them in the basement and began to paint them. He wanted to paint them white and make them so pretty and do some decorative work along the bed rails and what have you to make them look nice for the girls. And the first thing that he would later talk about, because they actually interviewed the Tallman family, and the first thing he would say is that the day he brought them home, he took them to the basement, he set them up so he could paint them, and had just begun to paint when his wife yelled that his sandwich was ready for lunch. So he laid the paintbrush down on the can lid that was open and ran upstairs to grab his sandwich, figuring it'd take, 15 minutes to eat a sandwich? He'd wolf it down and get back to work. He ran back downstairs and came kind of to a stop still because the paintbrush had been picked up and the handle had been shoved down in the white paint. And he couldn't figure out how that happened. It would have been one thing if he'd have laid it on top of the open can and maybe vibrated in or something, but that was not the case. So he cleaned off the paintbrush. He painted the bunk beds. He finished them up, took them back upstairs a few days later and assembled them in the girls' room. And the girls were thrilled. They were about 7 and 10, and they absolutely loved the bunk beds that Daddy had fixed up for them. But that was going to change really quick. So after the first couple nights, the girls began to run into their bedroom, into the mom and dad's bedroom, and wake the Tallmans up, crying that there was a bad man, that something bad was in the room, that they were afraid. And this went on almost night after night for about a week. And the girls, just, they would go to bed. They began to get anxious about going to bed because they thought that, this was going to happen again.
Right.
And Mr. and Mrs. Tallman would, talk to them and say, no, it's just nightmares. You just had bad dreams, or, your imagination's running away from you. All the stuff you try to talk to kids to, get them to be rational when you can't explain what's going on. And after about a week of this, Mr. Tallman decided he would sleep on the floor in the girls' bedroom for a night or two and see what was really happening. Because the girls were sincere. He could see they were sincere. And frankly, it was unnerving him a little because they were telling the same story. A man with terrible red eyes was standing, watching them, and a man would disappear, and it scared them. And, it just sounded awful. So he began to wonder if maybe somebody was coming into the house, a more rational thing. Somebody was creeping into the house. This house was all one level, so it was a possibility. He was checking the windows at night now, and he was double checking everything, and still, so he decided to sleep in the room. So he's laying on a pallet on the floor by the girls' bunk beds. The girls are sound asleep. He's gone to sleep, but it's not very comfortable, so you know how you toss and you turn when you're sleeping on the floor. And he rolled over and saw a man standing there, not more than 5 or 6 feet away from him. And it was an older gentleman. He had bloodshot kind of red eyes, not like glowing red eyes, but bloodshot red eyes. And he was almost had an inner light glowing out of him. And it creeped him out so bad. And his first thought was, oh my God, somebody is coming into the house. And he jumped up. And as he jumped up, the figure just disappeared. And he grabbed the girls and he headed for the master bedroom. And he told his wife what he saw. Well, that was that. So from that point forward, the girls either slept in the living room or they slept on the floor in their mom and dad's room for about another week or so. And finally, he nailed the window shut in the bedroom, and he did everything he could think of. And he said, well, I'll sleep in the room with them and see how it goes. But he got called into work. So he called a cousin of his and he said, hey, we're having some problems at the house. I don't really know what's going on, but the girls are scared to sleep in the bedroom alone. And I did see a guy there one night a few weeks ago. And he forgot to mention the guy who disappeared as soon as I jumped up part.
Sure.
So, he didn't mention that because he didn't want his cousin to have any presuppositions. Frankly, he was feeding them to the lions. So the cousin's like, yeah, sure, I'll come over and sleep at the house. Not a problem. I'll sleep in the girls' room and make sure that everything's okay. So he did. He came over. He laid down on the floor, made a little pallet. Girls were sound asleep in the bunk beds, and he can't get comfortable, so he never goes to sleep. He's just sort of laying there wishing he would have brought something more comfortable to sleep on. And at the foot of the bunk beds, he catches motion and he sees the same man. And he would later say he was filled with absolute terror and dread. Like, he didn't even have to guess. He didn't believe for a moment this was a living man. And he jumped up, the figure faded away, he grabbed the girls, ran out and yelled for his cousin's wife and the little boy, got them all rushed into the car. He was shaking. He couldn't talk about what had happened. He wouldn't talk about it. He just kept saying, we got to get out of here. We got to get out of here. We got to get out of here. He got him in his car. He took them down the street, and he sat down the street with them, refusing to let him go back into the house until his cousin came home. And then he told just his cousin what had happened. He didn't want to scare everybody else, so he wouldn't tell him. Over the course of the time the Tallmans lived in that house, Mr. Tallman would talk about things like one night he came in and he felt the living room was really cold. He sat his lunch bucket down on the floor, and he worked a night shift, so he was coming home like 4 in the morning, and was looking to see if like the air conditioner was on or something, because it was cold, and it was off. And he went over to pick up his lunch bucket to take it to the kitchen, and something kicked the lunch bucket, he said literally, like all the way across the room. And that startled him. It scared him. because there's no way by accident it could just fly the whole way across the room and hit the wall.
Right, right.
And another night he had even a larger fright. He parked in the driveway. There was an attached garage. He gets out of his car, and as he's looking at the house, he realizes the garage is on fire. Like there's flames licking up the wall of the garage. He panics. He runs into the house thinking, oh my God, I got to get the family out and call for help. And it's beginning to become a huge fire. He can see the whole front of the wall of the garage is beginning to engulf itself in flames. He runs into the house, screams for his wife, get the kids, the house is on fire. She goes running out. He goes to the kitchen to grab the phone to get, call 911, call help. And she comes in and she's like, what are you doing? What are you talking about? And he's like, get out, there's a fire. And she's like, there's no fire. He's like, no, there's a fire. And by now the police are on, and she's like, put the phone down, tell them you made a mistake, there's no fire. So the police officer's like, well, we're going to come out around anyway and just check because they can hear what's going on. And they're like, we better make sure there's no fire. So an officer stops, and there's no fire. There's no signs of a fire. There's no scorching or anything like that. But he clearly saw the whole front of the garage engulfed in flames. Eventually, the family would decide to move. But as he got to thinking about it, the one thing he didn't want to take with him were the bunk beds, because there was just this air about them that freaked him out. And he began to wonder if the bunk beds had something to do with what was going on in the house, because nothing had happened in that house for the first 4 months. Not until he brought the bunk beds in, and then the very day he brought them in, that was the first event. So he decides that he's going to destroy the bunk beds. So he contacts a guy that has a junkyard, and he says, look, I have this wooden set of bunk beds, and they're all broken up, and he makes sure they're all broken up. He breaks them all up, and he takes them over, and he says, will you burn them? The guy's like, sure, not a problem. A couple days later, he gets a phone call from this fella, and he's like, hey, I want to know, what's the history on them bunk beds? And the guy's like, why? And he's like, look, I burned them just like you asked me to, but I could hear children crying. And I went up that way to where the fire was at, thinking that some kids were around, how kids will get into a junkyard and stuff. And he said there weren't any kids, but there was a man standing there. There's an older man, and he had kind of red bloodshot eyes. And when I said to him, hey, what are you doing here? He disappeared. There's something really hanky about that bed. What's the backstory on it? And he's like, I honestly don't know. He went back and he did try to talk to the guy at the secondhand store. There are some indications that maybe it came out of a house where there had been a house fire, but there's nothing that we can really lay our fingers on. But it's a fascinating story because, there's really nothing to explain it. And after they got rid of the bunk beds, the activity stopped in their lives. They did sell the house. By then they had pretty much had all they could take of the house as well. So they sold the house, bought another place, and started, life over again, because they were just exhausted from that house. And so they moved on. But that is a fascinating story. And it's one that I have, puzzled over many times in my head. And it's the quintessential, to me, it's the quintessential story of a possessed object. Obviously, someone was attached to the house or to the bunk beds, and whoever it was, it's still a mystery to this day. But definitely, it was something to really consider. And there are so many of these stories. The Hope Diamond has left a trail of dead people behind. It's the largest, diamond in the world, and everybody who's ever owned it, very, very well-to-do people, have all come to very bad ends after taking possession of the diamond. Most of them have died because of the diamond in one way or another. Eventually, the diamond was donated to the Smithsonian because nobody wanted to own it. So by placing it there, it could still remain a possession of whoever donates it and keep it safely far away from themselves.
I have seen it. Yeah, I've been at the Smithsonian to see it.
Is it as beautiful as they say?
It's huge. Yeah, it's striking. Yeah.
I can't imagine.
Hmm.
I've seen pictures of it, but I'm sure the pictures don't do it justice. So, and I thought, we'll tell one more story. There are thousands of these stories. There are just thousands of them. Some of them, I know of many different types of objects: dolls, stuffed toys, umbrellas. There was an interesting post about on YouTube. What? No, excuse me. Facebook, I believe. And it was about this person who was trying to get rid of an umbrella stand. It was an elephant foot umbrella stand. So back in there, the early 1900s, people would go hunting elephants, and they would make elephant foot stools and umbrella stands and what have you out of the body parts. And I know it sounds very macabre today, but it was very common practice in its time. And they were trying to get rid of this umbrella stand. And it was interesting because what they said was, we have this elephant foot umbrella stand that we think is just absolutely god awful ugly. And if anybody wants it, you're welcome to it. But please know that my father goes with it. And you're like, what? So you read further down, and she says that it belonged to her father. It was one of his prized possessions, and that he has been seen since he passed away, hovering near this, elephant foot umbrella stand.
Wow.
And she was pretty sure, the woman who was trying to get rid of it, that if the umbrella stand went away, he would go with it. And I found that a fascinating, selling point, if you will. I don't know if it was a selling point, but it sounded the way she was, it was like, hey, somebody that was really interested in the paranormal might just buy it just for that reason.
Yeah, I'm interested in the paranormal, but I'm not going to have this ugly thing in my house. Just because something comes along as extra baggage.
Yeah, no, and you can still see them in places. There's a bar in Ligonier, PA that had, now this is 15, 20 years ago. I don't know if they're still there, but they had an entire room that the guy's father was a big game hunter, and it had all these stuffed animals, and they had the seats in that room were literally elephant foot seats.
Wow.
I remember my boys and I stumbled into this restaurant when we were up in Ligonier, and like my boys were so thrilled that they could sit on these, and like they were 5 and 7, and stuff like that. They were just little fellas, but it was just bizarre. I'd never seen elephant foot chairs before, but they were really elephant foot chairs. And the guy had this big display, and he was like, my father was a big game hunter, and I inherited all of this, and so I just kind of incorporated it in my business. But he didn't tell me any ghost stories. Probably
yeah, much to your chagrin, right? Yeah.
Well, I'm always open for a good ghost story, man. I'll tell you, it's rare that I'm not willing to hear a ghost story. But I just thought it was fascinating, and probably the one that's probably made the biggest splash in recent years is something called the Dybbuk box. So I'm kind of hitting some of the larger ones tonight, and we'll go back and we'll tell some smaller stories later. But the Dybbuk box, for those who don't know what it is, it's part of Jewish folklore, and it is a wine cabinet. Now, it's not like we think of it as huge. This thing's, about 3-4 feet tall, and it's got a drawer in it. It's got 2 doors that open, and the story behind it is that an antique dealer in around 2001 had bought it at an estate sale in Portland, Oregon, and the estate was that of a 103-year-old woman who had passed away. Her granddaughter had purchased this wine cabinet somewhere in her travels, and she just didn't want it. Her grandmother was a Jewish woman who had survived the Holocaust and World War II. She had said she had gotten the box during World War II, and then after the war was over, she had traveled to the United States, and there were only 3 objects that she still owned that she could bring with her, one of which was this wine cabinet. And she said that even though her grandmother would never let go of it, her grandmother also wouldn't display it. She kept it hidden. She said there was a spirit in there, a bad spirit, and that the spirit was a Dybbuk, is what she called it. And that's a Jewish word for an evil spirit. She had wanted the box buried with her when she died. but it's against Jewish tradition to put objects in the casket with the deceased. And so the family refused to do it. And so now the box is sitting there, and something's got to happen with it. So the dealer said, well, why don't you keep it? You know, it's obviously a remembrance of your grandmother, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful wooden box, very pretty. And she's like, no, I don't want it. We made a deal. You take it. I don't want it here. Just get it out of here. So he took the box. He didn't sell it. It didn't sell. So he took it to his antique shop, and he placed it in the basement. And as soon as he brought it into the shop, things started happening. His shop assistant called him a day or so later saying that the lights had all gone out, the doors and the security gates had all locked, and she heard terrible sounds coming from the basement. She was terrified. He came in and investigated, discovered that there was a horrible smell of cat urine in the air, and that every light bulb in the basement had been smashed. He couldn't figure out, he didn't associate it with the box at the time. He thought something else was going on. So eventually he gave it to I always have a hard time saying this because it just boggles my mind. He gave it to his mother as a gift, the wine box.
Maybe he didn't like his mom.
I don't know, because in fairness, I don't think he at that moment thought it was the box.
Yeah, associated the
right.
things with the box. Okay.
So right after he gives it to her, she has a major stroke in the hospital. Oh. He comes in to see her. He's, and he's trying to talk to her, and she can't really talk very well. And he keeps saying, what happened? And she's crying, and she's crying and crying. And she spells out HATEGIFT. Hate gift. She won't go home until the box is gone. So he takes the box back, and he thinks that his mother just associated the two because the box came in and then that day she had a stroke. Like, fine, that's okay. So he tries to give it away, but every time he tries to give it away, the box is brought back a couple days later, and people have these terrible stories to tell, that something bad happened to them, something evil happened to them. So he begins to suffer this horrible nightmare over and over again because, the box is still in his possession. It gets so bad that at one point, his staff tells him they'll quit if he doesn't get rid of the box. And then the nightmares, as I said, started. He can't breathe. He feels like something's breathing on his neck. He tries to turn his head, and there's this huge shadow hovering over him. And as he looks at it, it runs down the hallway, and he's had it. He's terrified. So he decides that he's had enough of this box. So he puts it on eBay, and he says, I've got this box. It's this beautiful piece of history. It's a Jewish wine box. And then he tells the story, what the girl said to him, what's happened since then. So if you buy the box, I want you to buy it with full knowledge that bad stuff could happen to you, and I don't want the box back. I won't take it. So there is a medical museum in Missouri where a gentleman by the name of Jason Huxton, who's the curator, thinks that this beautiful wine box would be a great addition. So he buys the box and he puts it in the museum. Stuff begins to happen in the museum. And again, his staff comes to him and says, either you get rid of that crazy box because bad stuff happens every time we have to work near it. Stuff happens in the part of the building it's being housed in. He began to get sick when he had it in his office. But he doesn't want to destroy it, and he doesn't know that he wants to get rid of it yet. Like, he doesn't really know what to do with it. So he takes it home and he puts it in the basement of his house, figuring he's going to figure it out. That night, his son says to him, it killed all the ants. He's like, what killed all the ants? And he's like, the box in the basement. It killed all the ants. And it's like, what are you talking about? And he went down, he looked, and there were these piles of ants, like how it's out in the country and what have you, as though they had been drawn to the box and they were just laying in heaps around the box, dead. And he thought that was really weird. Well, things begin to happen in the house, and things begin to happen with his family. They begin to get ill, nightmares. His wife and his son can't sleep. They start talking about having nightmares of a large shadowy figure that's pursuing them in their dreams. Just a lot of stuff happens. He finally decides that whatever's going on, this box got to go. Can't in good conscience give it to anybody else.
Right.
Because he's now a believer. He believes that this box is demonically possessed in some fashion. So he decides to bury it. So he digs a hole in his yard and he buries it. A couple of days later, his wife is walking out with the trash, taking the trash down to the sidewalk, and she cuts across the yard and almost falls into this huge sinkhole that suddenly had opened up in their yard, right where the box was. Well, it was, that's where he buried it.
Oh, okay.
So,
so it's still there, but it's not.
Okay. Yeah, it's still there. Okay. And if she had been like 6 inches more to the left, she would have fallen into this hole and died. It was very deep. Okay. So he ends up making arrangements. He gets a hold of a priest, and a Jewish priest, and he explains the whole story, and he contacts the antique dealer, and he gets everything, every detail he can get. So the belief is that during World War II, there were some young Jewish women who were trying to figure out a way to protect themselves, and so they imbued this box with a spirit, an evil spirit that would go out and kill the things around them, and that obviously didn't stop them from being taken to the concentration camps and what have you. And the only one to survive, or at least the one who survived the longest, was this old woman that was 103 when she died. She had kept the box so she could keep the Dybbuk at bay. And she knew how to do so. So it didn't hurt anybody else. And that's why she wanted it buried with her. She helped to put the thing in, and she was going to take it with her, so no one else could be harmed. But whatever the process was to deal with this went away with her. The Jewish priest managed to bind this entity to the box itself. It couldn't leave the box. The box subsequently was warehoused somewhere where it's serviced by the priests from time to time to keep in place the Dybbuk. Now, it has since been sold. It's now part of a collection of possessed objects. The guy from Ghost Adventures,
okay, yep,
purchased it with all the warnings and what have you in play. But it's a fascinating story, and the box definitely did make that journey. It is beyond interesting, and if you're interested in learning more, there is actually a book that Jason Huxton, Haxton, wrote. That was the museum curator who had all these vivid experiences, and I kind of glossed over a little and for the sake of time. But it's a fascinating story, and you can definitely get a copy of the book and read it. There was actually a movie called The Possession that was to be made off of that book. So it is an amazing story any way you look at it. And there are so many objects that we could talk about. The last story we're going to talk about is one that may not be true. I love Baker's Mansion, which is in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Right. It has some really cool ghost stories attached to it. It's also a really beautiful historical site, home of the Blair County Historical Society. And in there is this beautiful glass case. It weighs about 200 pounds. And inside of it is the wedding dress. And supposedly there's a wedding dress, a pair of little silk slippers, and a parasol. The story is that this was the dress of the only daughter of the Baker family. The Baker family built Baker Mansion. They are the only family to have ever lived in Baker Mansion. And Anna Baker, the daughter, according to the story, was in love with one of the workmen of her father. And her father was adverse to her marrying a workman because he was beneath her, and he felt, that she was not he was not worthy of this young woman's attention, but she was sincerely in love with him. And so the father called the workman into the house, had a conversation with him, and told him that they would shun Anna if she married him, and that Anna was not emotionally and financially equipped to live as a poor person, and she would grow to hate him if they married. And some accounts say that he paid off this man to leave, others just that he browbeat him to the point where he felt like if he married Anna, he was going to ruin her life. She'd never be able to talk to her parents or her brothers again. In any case, he left, and Anna told her father that if she could not marry the man she loved, she would marry no one at all. And she never did. She would die a spinster. In fact, she would be the last of the Baker family to live in the house. And then she willed it to a niece, the only child of her brother David, who was the only one of the other Bakers to have children, the only Baker to ever have a child. And then it was given to the Historical Society. Anna is supposed to haunt the house, and so is her other brother, Sylvester. And the dress is supposed to be haunted. Supposedly it moves on its own, and the parasol and the slippers will change positions. Now, the case is locked, and it takes 2 keys to unlock it. Most of the time, the curator and somebody else each have a key, so nobody can just get in and fuss with the dress.
Right.
But at one time, there was an older woman who worked there. She was the curator, and she had a very unique sense of humor. So she would tell people that Anna Baker came with a scent of strawberry, and she kept an atomizer in her pocket, and she would spray it and then call their attention to the fact that strawberries, were filling the room, and that must mean Anna was with them. And I have talked to former staff who have told me that indeed the dress moved, but usually because this lady would kick the case and kind of get it to shaking and then call their attention to it. So I do not know if the dress actually ever moved on its own. And the rest of the story is also not true. So the dress did not belong to Anna Baker. It actually belonged to one of the Bell sisters from the family that Bellwood is named for. And the story, when she had to admit that, then the story got a twist to it, and it was that the Bell girl and Anna were rivals, and Anna didn't want this Bell girl's dress in her bedroom, which is where the dress was archived. And so she would move the dress around because she was agitated that the dress was in her room. And she never got to wear a wedding dress, and this Bell girl used to rub her nose in it. I don't know that there's any truth to the ghost story, but you will find it everywhere, all over the place, that this dress is possessed by the spirit of Anna Baker. Is it? I sincerely doubt it. I do know that there have been many instances of her being seen in the building. There are instances of Sylvester being seen and heard. Lots of ghost stories about the building. I just question that one story. So as though I tell a lot of ghost stories and people probably think I'm very gullible, I'm really not. I do question a lot of things. Some stories just have to be passed on as what they are. They're just stories, and you'll have to take them and decide for yourself. Frankly, I think all ghost stories are that way. But there are stories that I have been able to get backstories on, this dress being one of them. And I'm fairly sure, not 100% positive, but definitely fairly sure that this dress is not possessed by Anna Baker or the Bell girl or anybody else. But it made a really good gimmick, got a lot of publicity, and brought a lot of people to the museum in the 1970s and early 80s. So I guess that this woman did what she needed to do. And with that, I am done.
Okay. Well, some thoughts about the stories that you've told today. So the cannonball, going all the way back to the first one. The whole purpose of a cannonball is to destroy enemy structures and or personnel.
Right.
I mean, that's its purpose. I mean, that's what it was made for. So if it did that and did end up taking someone's life, you think that, it's possible that somebody would be associated with that. Some of the other takeaways I have from this is buy new, don't buy used stuff. All right. And if I could regale I'll try to do this as succinctly as possible. So when Mrs. Stu and I were in Germany, we went to, I can't remember exactly where it was we bought it, but we basically bought this painting, lithograph, whatever, and we called him Fritz. Okay, so German guy, felt hat, feather, and it had a wooden frame that actually, 4 pieces, but they extended out on the corners like
Okay.
this. Okay. And they were like riveted together. And we called him Fritz. And he was our good luck charm. So after we got married, we were both Air Force, but we did get married in Germany. We put him over the bed where we slept. And he became our good luck charm. And it so happened that, finally Mrs. Stu got pregnant with our only son, because, she was basically told, you're not going to have children. And so we considered Fritz a really good luck charm. So fast forward, we moved back to the States. We moved into our first house. And this house was on a kind of a small house built in 1927, less than 1,000 square feet, but enough for us. All right. Long yard, really long, like 300 and some feet. And then behind it was the Catholic cemetery in Bellefonte. So again, the position of honor, Fritz went right above our bed. And until one night that I was actually awoken, and I looked at the foot of the bed, and there was a shadow that came up from the foot of the bed and then just kind of like flew over the top of the bed through Fritz into the back of the house. And I'm thinking like, okay, what's going on here? So I can't say anything bad happened. Since Fritz was affected that way, Fritz came down unceremoniously, and I didn't let Mrs. Stu know for many years that was the reason why. So he was our good luck charm, and did something sully that? I don't know. But it's certainly, I can't say our luck changed, but we had some bad fortune happen after that.
Yeah.
Problems with the car. We hit a deer. Well, in Pennsylvania, you're going to hit a deer at some point, I think, if you're going to drive in Pennsylvania. But unlikely place, had different car accidents, and just bad luck until we finally got rid of Fritz. I mean, Fritz, even in the house we're living in right now, we had Fritz, but he was relegated to the garage, and I think one of our last yard sales, Fritz went.
Yeah. But you do make a good point. Not everything that has something attached to it is negative. I once knew a woman who had, she had a very rough childhood. She was from a broken home. Her father was an alcoholic and drug addict, and he was who was raising her. Her mother had taken off and left her there. So she was a very troubled, sad child. And she had gone into, I don't want to say broken into, it was an old abandoned house. So she really didn't break into it. It wasn't locked or anything. But she would go there and sit to get away from her dad when he was in a bad mood and aggressive and what have you. And there was this painting of a very stern man. She always called him the captain. She thought he looked like a sea captain.
Mm-hmm.
And she took that painting out of that old house. It would probably have just gotten ruined over time anyway. And she kept him with her. She believed that he protected her, and she kept him up in her bedroom. She still has him to this day. At one point, however, she had a good friend who was moved into a house, and there was some really negative paranormal stuff happening. She loaned this painting to her friend and told the captain, you need to help her get rid of the ghost. And as long as the painting was hanging in her friend's house, everything was good. But then stuff started to happen in her home. So she finally told her friend, I'm so sorry, but I need the captain back. She truly believes that he was her guardian angel, if you will, and watches over her. And I can't tell you that he didn't, but she speaks of nothing but positives about him in her life. So not all things that have something attached is negative at all. And although we like to tell those stories, and those are the ones that seem to catch our imagination, your story of Fritz reminded me very much that not everything is negative, and we should probably say that before we ended.
Sounds good. Yeah, hope I didn't spend too long with Fritz, But
no, I think it's a fascinating story. I love that story.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, I will tell you that was my last ghost story for this evening.
Thank you. I enjoyed all of them very much. And if our listeners and viewers have enjoyed, please consider clicking the like button down below on YouTube or through your your whatever channel you go through to get your podcasts. Consider subscribing if you're a brand new listener to us. We have the Facebook page, The Paranormalist Podcast. And actually, if you go to theparanormalistpodcast.com, you get forwarded to our YouTube page, I believe. And we also have an email address, paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. And I realize those are all very, very long, so I will put links for them below into the show notes so that you can simply just click on them and not have to worry about typing them in. So with that, I think I've said my piece, and I would bid you adieu for this evening.
And the same here. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Patty.